Hello again. This is Steve Turner. We're at the First United Methodist Church. I teach the Koinonia Sunday School class every Sunday. And recently we have been studying the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. This is a continuation of our studies, and we are now in letter 19. And if you remember, the letters are from Screwtape to Wormwood. Both of these are demons and are after people's souls. Wormwood is a freshly minted temptress or tempter, and he is getting advice from a seasoned veteran who is Screwtape. So let's go ahead and start letter 19. We'll refer back to some other letters as we move into this letter. So let's start, as he always does. My dear Wormwood, I've been thinking very hard about the question in your last letter. If, as I have clearly shown, all selves are by their very nature in competition, and therefore the enemy's idea of love is a contradiction in terms, what becomes of my reiterated warning that he really loves the human vermin and really desires their freedom and continued existence? I hope, my dear boy, you have not shown my letters to anyone. Not that it matters, of course. Anyone would see that the appearance of heresy into which I have fallen is purely accidental. By the way, I hope you understood, too, that some apparently uncomplimentary references to slubgob were purely jocular. I really have the highest respect for him. And, of course, some things I said about not shielding you from the authorities were not seriously meant. You can trust me to look after your interests, but do keep everything under lock and key. So Screwtape is revealing his true character here. He's really a liar. He's untrustworthy. And he's actually a heretic because he really understands who God is and what God wants for human being, even though he refers to us human as vermin. He goes on, the truth is I slipped by mere carelessness into saying that the enemy really loves the humans. That, of course, is an impossibility. He is one being. They are distinct from him. Their good cannot be his. All his talk about love must be a disguise for something else. He must have some real motive for creating them and taking so much trouble about them. The reason one comes to talk as if he really had the impossible love is our utter failure to find out what the real motive is. What does he stand to make out of them? That is the insoluble question. I do not see that it can do any harm to tell you that this very problem was the chief cause of our father's quarrel with the enemy, of the devil's quarrel with God. When the creation of man was first mooted, and when, even at that stage, the enemy freely confessed that he foresaw a certain episode about a cross, our Father freely confessed that he foresaw a certain episode about the cross. Our Father very naturally sought an interview and asked for an explanation. The enemy gave no reply except to produce the cock-a-bull story about disinterested love, which he has been circulating ever since. This our Father naturally could not accept. He implored the enemy to lay his cards on the table and gave him every opportunity. He admitted that he felt a real anxiety to know the secret. The enemy replied, I wish with all my heart that you did. It was, I imagine, at this stage in the interview that our Father's disgust at such an unprovoked lack of confidence caused him to remove himself an infinite distance from the presence with a suddenness which has given rise to the ridiculous enemy story that he was forcibly thrown out of heaven. Since then, we have begun to see our oppressor was so secretive. Why our oppressor was so secretive? His throne depends on the secret. All right. We know that he cannot really love anybody. Nobody can. It doesn't make any sense. All right, let's stop there. For the devil and for his lieutenants, his foot soldiers, love makes no sense. There's got to be some ulterior motive. And they call it a mystery. They call it a secret. They call it a cheat. They call it whatever. But they just can't understand why God would love human beings. Not only that, in this letter, he mentions the cross, which was the straw that broke the camel's back for the angel who fell from heaven, who is now the devil and Satan. And so this gives us a clear understanding of who the devil is and what he wants with our souls. He doesn't understand love. He thinks it's a trick. And so everything and every strategy they have is to attack this mystery, this cheat, this bamboozlement that God has played on everyone, not just the humans, but also on the demons and the angels. He goes on further. You complain that my last letter does not make it clear whether I regard being in love as a desirable state for a human or not. But really, Wormwood, that is the sort of question one expects them to ask. Leave them to discuss whether love or patriotism or celibacy or candles on the altar or teetotalism or education are good or bad. Can't you see there's no answer? Nothing matters at all except the tendency of a given state of mind in given circumstances to move a particular patient at a particular moment nearer to the enemy or nearer to us. So good or bad, for the devil there is no moral compass. There is no difference between good or bad. It's all a game. It's all, can the devil use whatever? And he does use virtues. He uses the fruits of the Spirit. He uses the good things, the pleasures that God has endowed us with and shared with us. He uses those to his benefit. He warps them. He turns them into something bad, which we in church, we call that sin. He talks about marriage quite a bit. He's talked about that in his previous letters. He talks about sex in his previous letters and how Wormwood can turn that to his advantage with the patient. He ends this with stating something about marriage. There must be several young women in your patient's neighborhood who would render the Christian life intensely difficult to him. Why have you not reported this to me? In the meantime, get it quite clear in your own mind that this state of falling in love is not in and of itself necessarily favorable either to us or to the other side. It is simply an occasion which we and the enemy are both trying to exploit. Like most of the other things which humans are excited about, such as health and sickness, age and youth, or war and peace, it is from the point of view of the spiritual life mainly raw material. So all the things that give us excitement and pain and suffering, he talks about health and sickness, he talks about age and youth, and that's the time we spend on this earth. He talks about war and peace. He could talk about victory and losses. He could talk about all kinds of things, but to the devil, it doesn't really matter. And with respect to your spiritual life, all these things are raw material. Now, this assumes, and this really makes the case that we do have a spiritual life, which the biggest strategy the devil has is to really convince us that there is no spiritual life, that we are simply here for our whatever appointed number of years are. We die, and then that's the end. There was nothing before, there's nothing after. The spiritual life tells us something else. The spiritual life tells us, at least in the Christian sense, that there is something after. There is an eternity. And you remember in the letter which he discussed time with Wormwood, he talked about the present, he talked about the past, he talked about the future, but Screwtape also talked about the eternal and how it's very difficult for humans to understand the eternal but the nearest thing that humans experience to the eternal is the present. And so he advises Wormwood to concentrate on the past and the future, not the present. So again, advice from Screwtape to Wormwood. Let's continue into letter 2020. I note with great displeasure that the enemy has for the time being put a forcible end to your direct attacks on the patient's chastity. You ought to have known that he always does in the end, and you ought to have stopped before you reached that stage. For as things are, your man has now discovered the dangerous truth that these attacks don't last forever. Consequently, you cannot use what is, after all, our best weapon, the belief of ignorant humans that there is no hope of getting rid of us except by yielding. I suppose you've tried persuading him that chastity is unhealthy. I haven't yet got a report on the young women in the neighborhood. I should like it at once, for if you can't use his sexuality to make him unchaste, we must try to use it for the promotion of a desirable marriage. In the meantime, I would like to give you some hints about the type of woman, the physical type, which he should be encouraged to fall in love with if falling in love is the best we can manage. So now he talks about the kind of partner, the kind of mate that would be good for the patient. And good for the patient here is from the devil's point of view, winning the patient's soul for the devil. So he talks about the current trends, and remember this is 1942, and he talks about the current fashion of beauty, what it has been, what it is. He talks about, as regards to the male's taste, we have varied a great deal. At one time, we have the statuesque and aristocratic type of beauty, mixing men's vanity with their desires and encourage the race to breed chiefly from the most arrogant and prodigal women. At another, we have accepted an exaggeratedly feminine type, faint and languishing, so that folly and cowardice and all the general falseness and littleness of mind which go with them shall be at a premium. At present, 1942, we are at the opposite tack. The age with them shall be at the opposite tack. The age of jazz has succeeded the age of waltz, and we now teach men to like women whose bodies are scarcely distinguishable from those of boys, and so on and so on. So he says whatever the current fashion is, take advantage of that. This is the general strategy of the moment. But inside this framework, you will still find it possible to encourage your patient's desires in one of two directions. You will find, if you look carefully into any human heart, that he is haunted by at least two imaginary women, a terrestrial and an infernal Venus. And his desire differs qualitatively according to its object. There is the one type, which his desire is such to be naturally amenable to the enemy, readily mixed with charity, readily obedient to marriage, colored all through with the golden light of reverence and naturalness, which we detest. There's another type, which he desires brutally and desires to desire within the marriage. He would tend to treat as a slave, an idol, or an accomplice. His love for the first might involve what the enemy calls evil, but only accidentally. The man would wish that she was not someone else's wife and be sorry that he could not love her lawfully. But in the second type, the felt evil is what he wants. It is that tang in the flavor which he is after. In the face, it is the visible animality or the sulkiness or craft or cruelty which he likes, and in the body, something quite different from what he ordinarily calls beauty. So again, he's encouraging Wormwood to steer the patient towards a particular kind of woman. The second type of woman he calls the infernal Venus. He says the real use of the infernal Venus is no doubt as a prostitute or mistress. But if your man is a Christian, and if he has been well trained in nonsense about irresistible and all-excusing love, he can often be induced to marry her. and that is very well worth bringing about. You will have failed as regard fornication and solitary vice, but there are other and more indirect methods of using a man's sexuality to his undoing. And by the way, they are not only efficient but delightful. The unhappiness produced is a very lasting and exquisite kind. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. So again, he's trying to encourage Wormwood to find a suitable mate, suitable wife for the patient. Patient is a young man. And he wants a report on the available women, which Wormwood is kind of a lazy tempter. He hasn't done that. He hasn't done that in his report. But again, we're going to see that Wormwood, again, is not a very skillful tempter, and he's going to fail with respect to a marriage partner also. Which puts us at the last chapter we will discuss today. The last chapter last letter is letter 21. And again, this goes back to Screwtape's advice to Wormwood about distraction and annoyance. And he starts off early in one of his early letters about his relationship to his mother and how they can annoy each other and how they can get on each other's nerves and bother each other and so on and so on. So let's go ahead and start. And this is kind of a continuation of the last letter. Yes, a period of sexual temptation is an excellent time for working in a subordinate attack on the patient's peevishness. It may even be the main attack as long as he thinks it's the subordinate one. But here, as in everything else, the way must be prepared for your moral assault by darkening his intellect. Let's stop there. If you remember, in one of his previous letters, he talks about concentric circles with respect to us as humans. So he starts off with the inner circle, which is our will, which is our hearts. He moves to the intellect, and then he moves to the fantasy. The devil is always trying to move us from the inner to the outer, from fantasy to the will. From the will to fantasy. So he wants us to live in a fantasy world, so to speak, which he will create and help us to nurture. On the other hand, God wants us to move from fantasy to what is true, to our true self, to the inner circle of who we really are. And so he talks about this, darkening his intellect. Even in his first letter, he talks about reason. And reason is very dangerous to the devil, as is science. So he really advises Wormwood, don't let the patient read science, and especially don't let him think about it. Because really, when you think about science, it's about unseen things. Have you ever seen an atom? Have you ever seen gravity? I'm an economist. Have you ever seen a demand curve? No, it's kind of a creation that we use to explain things, just as gravity and atoms and molecules and germs and all these other things are names that we use to explain things, and we have discovered that they are real. And so he's going to encourage them to darken his intellect. Men are not angered by mere misfortune, but by misfortune conceived as injury. And the sense of injury depends on the feeling that a legitimate claim has been denied. The more claims on life, therefore, that your patient can be induced to make, the more often he will feel injured and, as a result, ill-tempered. They anger him because he regards his time as his own, and he feels that it is being stolen. You must therefore zealously guard in his mind this curious assumption, my time is my own. Let's stop there. The devil wants you to think that each day is yours. He wants you to wake up and think of that day. You have lots of things to do. Anything that gets in the way of that plan for that day, whether it's an enjoyable plan or not, or whatever the plan is, that's going to make you angry. And that's what the devil wants to happen. He wants any deviation from your plan to rile you up. What we really know is the day is given to us by God. And really, we mentioned before that God is going to give us opportunities to serve. And a lot of times, those opportunities are not going to be planned. If you remember the story of the Good Samaritan, the reason that the people did not stop to help the injured man is because they had things to do. But if we remember who did stop, he had things to do too. But he stopped. He took care of the injured Samaritan, of the injured man. He was a Samaritan. And then he took him to a place where he could stay and be well taken care of and healed. And he said, I will pay for this man to stay here and let me know if you need anything else with respect to his situation. That's a great story because it tells us, it's so telling to us in this current situation we're in today. Because a lot of the opportunities that confront us, they're easy to pass up. And we have to, each of us, deal with that on our own personal level. And he says here, this assumption is just crazy. When if the patient, if the human could think about this, he would see how crazy this is to think that his time is his own. He didn't do anything for it. He was kind of just given it. He was born and given each day. Now, what we're going to see is he wants to work this day is mine, my time is my own. He wants to work that even further. And he says the sense of ownership in general is always to be encouraged. The humans are always putting up claims to ownership which sound equally funny in heaven and in hell, and we must keep them doing so. Much of the modern resistance to chastity comes from men's belief that they own their own bodies, those vast and perilous estates pulsating with the energy that made the worlds in which they find themselves without their consent, in which they are injected at the pleasure of another. It is as if a royal child whom the Father has placed, for love's sake, in titular command of some great province under the real rule of wise counselors, should come to fancy he really owns the cities, the forests, the corn, and in the same way he owns the brick on his nursery floor. We produce this sense of ownership not only by pride, but by confusion. And this is where he takes us through a series of steps to get to the most pernicious use of my. So he talks about, we teach them to notice the different senses, not to notice the different senses of the possessive pronoun, the finely graded differences that run from my boots through my dog, my servant, my wife, my father, my master, my country, to my God. My God, in a sense, not really very different from my boots, meaning the God on whom I have a claim for my distinguished services and whom I exploit from the pulpit, the God I have done a corner in. So, we make God in our image, and if that doesn't fit, he says, go to another church, shop around. If that doesn't fit, just let go of it, because you're not to adapt to God. God is to adapt to you. At that point, you are Screwtapes. Your soul is Screwtapes. And all the time, the joke is that the word mine, in its fully possessive sense, cannot be uttered by a human being about anything. In the long run, either our Father or the enemy will say mine, of each thing that exists, and specifically of each man. They will find out in the end, never fear, to whom their time, their souls, and their bodies really belong. Certainly not to them, whatever happens. At present, the enemy says mine of everything on the pedantic, legalistic ground that he made it. Our Father, the devil, hopes in the end to say mine of all things on the more realistic and dynamic ground of conquest. And what we see here is Screwtape is bringing us to the realization that our tempters want us to think that things are mine, when in fact, nothing is mine. Everything we have has been given to us, or we think we've earned it, but in a sense, we've been lucky to earn it. So whatever your job is, whatever your occupation is, whatever your skill set is, there were points in that trip, in that path that you took, where people were gracious and generous to you, where they probably hired you. They might have helped you succeed in that particular occupation. They gave you opportunities. And hopefully you took advantage of those and you succeeded. Now that goes back to the skills that God gives us and the gifts that God gives us. Hopefully we discover those and we use those to His purpose. And in the process, we grow as human beings. But again, as he ends this letter, Screwtape is telling Wormwood, one of the best strategies you can ever have is to concentrate with the patient, with this human, on reinforcing his idea of things are his. And the way you do that is start with his time. And then whenever that's challenged, that's really going to upset him. And that'll damage his relationships in turn, especially his relationship with God. Thank you for being with us during this time. And we'll sign off right now, and we'll see you again in the next lesson that we have.